What was found after Marilyn Monroe's death? The house was silent. Not the peaceful silence of an ordinary Sunday morning, but the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural, as though time itself had stopped moving. Outside, the streets of Brentwood were calm beneath the warm California sun. Birds sang from the trees that lined Fifth Helena Drive. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that history was quietly unfolding behind the white stucco walls of a modest Spanish-style home. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing suggested that within a matter of hours, this quiet neighborhood would be surrounded by reporters, photographers, detectives, and curious onlookers. By sunset, the address would be known around the world. Inside the house, every room remained exactly as it had been left. A book rested where someone intended to continue reading. A telephone waited beside the bed. Prescription bottles stood on a nearby table. Clothing hung neatly inside the closet. Fresh flowers still decorated parts of the home. Everything appeared strangely ordinary. Yet those ordinary objects would soon become extraordinary. Every room would be photographed. Every drawer would be opened. Every handwritten note would be examined. Investigators did not know which detail might matter. Neither did the millions of people who would spend the next 6 decades searching for answers. Because the question was never simply how Marilyn Monroe died. The question that refused to disappear was far more unsettling. What did the final days of her life really look like? And what did the evidence inside her home actually reveal? Over the years, countless books, films, television programs, and newspaper articles have attempted to answer those questions. Some relied on documented evidence, others relied on rumor. Many blurred the line between the two. This story follows a different path. Everything you are about to hear is built upon the historical record, official documents, contemporary reporting, and the accounts of people who were directly connected to Marilyn Monroe during the final chapter of her life. Because the truth does not need exaggeration. The truth is compelling enough on its own. Long before the world knew her as Marilyn Monroe, she was simply Norma Jean. She entered the world on the first day of June, 1926, in Los Angeles, California. Her childhood was anything but glamorous. Her mother, Gladys Baker, struggled with serious mental illness, making it impossible to provide a stable home. As a result, Norma Jean spent much of her childhood moving between foster families, relatives, and the Los Angeles Orphans' Home. She learned very early that stability could disappear overnight. A house did not always mean home. The people around you did not always stay. Those experiences shaped her in ways that fame could never erase. Friends who knew Marilyn years later often described a woman who desperately wanted something most people rarely think about: a place where she felt safe. She wanted permanence. She wanted peace. She wanted a home that no one could take away. It is one of the great ironies of her life that the house forever associated with her death was also the first home she had ever truly owned. Before Hollywood, before photographers chased her through studio gates, before magazine covers carried her face across the world, her future seemed uncertain. Everything changed during the Second World War. While working at the radio plane factory in California, she was photographed by David Conover, a military photographer documenting women contributing to the war effort. The photographs immediately stood out. She possessed something cameras rarely found. She did not simply pose. She communicated emotion. Modeling assignments soon followed. Magazine covers led to studio meetings. Then came a new contract. And with that contract came a new identity. Norma Jean became Marilyn Monroe. Hollywood had created countless stars before, but Marilyn quickly became something different. She was impossible to ignore. Audiences remembered her voice. They remembered her smile. They remembered the effortless charm that seemed to exist every time the camera began rolling. Films such as Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, The 7-Year Itch, Bus Stop, and Some Like It Hot transformed her into one of the most recognizable women on Earth. Success arrived quickly. Global fame followed. But fame has a habit of revealing only one side of a person's life. The woman appearing on cinema screens was confident, elegant, playful. The woman returning home after filming often carried burdens invisible to the public. Marilyn took acting far more seriously than many critics realized. She studied with respected teachers. She read classic literature. She admired performers known for emotional depth rather than celebrity. She wanted to become an actress remembered for her craft. Hollywood often wanted something simpler: a beautiful face, a marketable image, a box office sensation. That conflict followed her throughout her career. Behind every glamorous photograph existed someone determined to be taken seriously. By the beginning of 1962, Marilyn Monroe stood at a crossroads. To the public, her career appeared uncertain. Headlines focused on missed filming days, health concerns, and production delays during the making of Something's Got to Give. Many newspapers suggested that one of Hollywood's brightest stars was fading. But headlines rarely tell the entire story. Behind closed doors, another reality was beginning to emerge. Negotiations with 20th Century Fox had resumed. Discussions about future projects continued. Friends later recalled moments of renewed optimism. Marilyn was making plans again. She spoke about work. She discussed upcoming opportunities. She had recently purchased the Brentwood house she hoped would become the stable home she had searched for since childhood. For the first time in her life, the future did not appear completely uncertain. Looking back now, knowing what happened only weeks later, those ordinary plans feel almost heartbreaking. Because none of the people sitting with Marilyn during those conversations could have imagined that investigators would soon walk through the same front door, documenting every room she had so carefully made her own. Because none of the people sitting with Marilyn during those conversations could have imagined that investigators would soon walk through the same front door, documenting every room she had so carefully made her own. In the weeks leading up to her death, Marilyn Monroe's life was far more active than many people now assume. The public image told one story. The historical record tells another. Newspaper headlines focused on missed filming days and disagreements surrounding Something's Got to Give. To many readers, it appeared as though Marilyn's career was collapsing. But behind those headlines, negotiations with 20th Century Fox had begun to change. Studio executives understood something that audiences already knew. Marilyn Monroe was not easily replaceable. Despite the production problems, discussions about bringing her back to the film were underway. New financial terms were being considered, and future projects remained part of the conversation. Her professional life was uncertain, but it was not over. At the same time, Marilyn was slowly settling into the Brentwood house she had purchased only a few months earlier. Friends remembered that she spoke proudly about the property. Unlike the luxurious estates owned by many Hollywood celebrities, this house felt personal. It reflected comfort rather than extravagance. The rooms were filled with books she intended to read, records she enjoyed listening to, paintings that caught her attention, and furniture chosen for comfort instead of appearance. For perhaps the first time since childhood, Marilyn had a place she could truly call her own. That simple fact carried enormous emotional weight. Throughout her life, homes had always belonged to someone else. Foster families, relatives, studios, hotels. temporary apartments. Now, finally, she held the keys to a front door that belonged only to her. Visitors often described the atmosphere inside the house as surprisingly peaceful. Sunlight entered through large windows. Fresh flowers frequently decorated the rooms. The decor was tasteful but modest, reflecting Marilyn's appreciation for art, books, and quiet spaces, more than Hollywood glamour. There were no signs of someone trying to impress visitors. Instead, the house felt lived in, human, real. Yet behind that calm exterior, Marilyn continued to face challenges that had followed her for years. She struggled with chronic insomnia. Sleep did not come easily. Like many people experiencing long periods of stress, she relied on physicians for treatment, and over time she received prescriptions intended to help manage sleep and anxiety. At the time, this was not unusual in Hollywood. Many actors and entertainers were prescribed medications that today would be approached with much greater caution. Medical understanding, prescribing practices, and awareness of dependency were very different during the early 1960s. That historical context matters. It helps explain why investigators would later pay such close attention to the medications found inside her bedroom. Those bottles were not automatically evidence of wrongdoing. They were part of a much larger picture that investigators needed to understand. Marilyn also remained in regular contact with several people in her personal and professional life. She spoke with friends. She communicated with business associates. She continued discussing future work. The historical record shows a woman whose life contained both hope and uncertainty at the same time. That complexity is often lost when history is reduced to a single headline. As the calendar turned toward the beginning of August, nothing suggested that the Brentwood house would soon become the focus of worldwide attention. The garden remained quiet. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Inside the home, everyday life continued through ordinary routines that seemed entirely unremarkable. A book left open, a pair of reading glasses resting on a table, letters waiting to be answered, appointments still ahead, plans not yet completed. No one could know that these ordinary details would soon become part of an official investigation, carefully documented by detectives searching for answers. In the days that followed, Marilyn's schedule would become one of the most closely examined timelines in Hollywood history. Who visited? Who called? What plans had she made? And what happened during the final hours before the silence inside the Brentwood house was finally broken? Those questions would shape an investigation that continues to fascinate historians, journalists, and film lovers more than 6 decades later. Those questions would shape an investigation that continues to fascinate historians, journalists, and film lovers more than 6 decades later. As the first days of August arrived, Marilyn Monroe appeared determined to move forward. The difficulties surrounding Something's Got to Give had dominated entertainment headlines for weeks, but those headlines captured only part of the story. Behind the scenes, conversations with 20th Century Fox had become increasingly constructive. Executives recognized what audiences already knew. Marilyn Monroe remained one of the studio's most valuable stars. There were discussions about returning to the production. There were conversations about new financial terms. There were ideas for future projects that extended well beyond a single film. To someone reading only newspaper headlines, it might have seemed as though Marilyn's career had reached its end. The documented evidence suggests something far more complex. Professionally, uncertainty remained, but so did opportunity. Friends who spent time with Marilyn during this period later described moments of optimism mixed with exhaustion. Some remembered her speaking enthusiastically about work. Others recalled that she appeared physically tired after months of stress. Both descriptions can be true at the same time. Human lives rarely move in only one direction. Hope and anxiety often exist side by side. Inside the Brentwood house, Marilyn tried to establish routines that felt ordinary. She enjoyed reading. She spent time arranging the rooms exactly as she wanted them. Books occupied shelves throughout the house, reflecting interests that reached far beyond Hollywood. Literature, poetry, biographies, and works on psychology revealed a woman who remained intellectually curious throughout her life. Visitors often noticed that she enjoyed quiet conversations far more than lavish parties. The public image suggested constant glamour. The private reality was often much quieter. She valued moments of peace. She appreciated simple afternoons at home. She surrounded herself with objects that carried personal meaning rather than extravagant value. Looking back today, those ordinary details feel especially significant. Not because they predicted what was about to happen, but because they remind us that history's most famous figures still lived ordinary moments between extraordinary headlines. As investigators would later discover, the Brentwood house contained the traces of everyday life. Nothing about those rooms had been arranged for history. Nothing had been preserved as a museum. It was simply someone's home. That is precisely why the evidence found there mattered. Every object existed in its natural place. Every room reflected how Marilyn had actually been living. For investigators, preserving that scene exactly as they found it became essential. Every photograph taken inside the house served a purpose. Every note written by detectives attempted to capture details before anything changed. Long before the public debated theories, law enforcement focused on careful observation. What was present? What was absent? What could be verified? Those questions guided the investigation from the very beginning. In the years that followed, countless claims would circulate through books, magazines, television specials, and later across the internet. Some stories would prove accurate. Others would become so frequently repeated that many people assumed they were true, despite lacking reliable evidence. Separating documented fact from decades of speculation remains one of the greatest challenges when examining Marilyn Monroe's final days. That is why the official timeline matters. Unlike rumors, a documented timeline allows events to be examined in sequence. Phone calls, meetings, visitors, medical appointments. Each confirmed event helps build a clearer picture of Marilyn's final week without relying on assumptions. It is a picture that remains incomplete in places, but far more detailed than many people realize. As the days passed, no one outside Marilyn's closest circle could have imagined that the quiet routine inside the Brentwood house was approaching its final chapter. The flowers continued to bloom in the garden. The California summer remained warm. Cars passed the house without slowing down. Neighbors had no reason to believe that within a matter of days, television cameras from around the world would line the same street. The transformation from private residence to historic location happened almost overnight. But before detectives documented the bedroom, before photographers captured the scene, before investigators began cataloging every item inside the house, there was one final weekend. A weekend whose confirmed events would become some of the most carefully examined moments in Hollywood history. There was another reason the Brentwood house mattered so much to Marilyn. It represented control. For much of her life, important decisions had been made by other people. Studios shaped her public image. Columnists shaped public opinion. Photographers captured carefully staged moments that often revealed very little about the person standing in front of the camera. Inside the Brentwood house, those expectations disappeared. Friends who visited during the summer of 1962 described a quieter Marilyn than the woman the public imagined. She enjoyed sitting outside in the garden. She spent hours reading. She listened to music. She talked about films she still hoped to make and roles she believed would finally allow audiences to see her as a serious, dramatic actress. Those conversations matter because they remind us of something easily forgotten.
History often views famous lives from the ending backward.
Knowing how Marilyn's story ended can make it seem as though everything was inevitably leading toward tragedy. The historical record tells a more complicated story. Her career still faced challenges. Her health remained a concern. But negotiations with 20th Century Fox had reopened possibilities that only weeks earlier appeared impossible. Studio executives understood the value Marilyn still carried. Reports from the period indicate that discussions about a new agreement had become increasingly positive. There were reasons for cautious optimism. The future remained uncertain, but it had not disappeared. That balance between hope and uncertainty defined much of Marilyn's final summer. Some days brought encouraging news. Others reminded her how demanding life in Hollywood could be. Like many people living under extraordinary pressure, she experienced moments of confidence followed by moments of doubt. Those who knew her personally rarely described a woman living inside a single emotion. Instead, they described someone whose life contained contradictions. She could be charismatic in public and deeply private at home. She could appear confident before a camera while privately questioning herself. She could speak excitedly about tomorrow while still carrying the weight of yesterday. It is that complexity that makes the final investigation so important. Investigators were not examining the home of a fictional character. They were entering the home of a real person whose life could not be reduced to a single headline. Every object inside the house existed within that larger story. The books reflected curiosity. The artwork reflected personal taste. The handwritten papers reflected daily life. Even the ordinary routines preserved inside the home offered investigators valuable context. This is why experienced investigators begin with observation before interpretation. They record what is there. They avoid conclusions until the evidence has been carefully examined. That same approach guides this documentary. Rather than beginning with speculation, we begin with the documented facts, the verified timeline, the confirmed visitors, the official investigation. Only after those foundations are established can larger questions be explored responsibly. As the first days of August drew to a close, the Brentwood house remained what it had always been to Marilyn, a refuge from the noise of Hollywood. Outside its walls, newspapers continued searching for dramatic headlines. Inside, life appeared remarkably ordinary. The kitchen still held the signs of recent meals. The living room remained neatly arranged. Letters and personal papers waited where they had been left. Nothing inside the house suggested that it would soon become part of American history. Yet history often arrives without warning. It enters quietly. It transforms ordinary places into unforgettable ones. Within a matter of days, the peaceful home Marilyn had hoped would symbolize a new beginning would instead become the center of one of the most carefully documented investigations in Hollywood history. And before detectives photographed a single room or cataloged a single item, a final series of confirmed events unfolded during the first days of August. Events that would determine everything that followed. That is where our story now turns. The first days of August 1962 unfolded without the dramatic signs that people often expect when looking back at history. There was no moment when anyone could point to the calendar and say, "This is where everything changed." Life rarely works that way. Events that later become historic usually begin as ordinary days. For Marilyn Monroe, the opening days of August appeared to be a mixture of routine, uncertainty, and cautious optimism. Her professional future remained under discussion. Her Brentwood home continued to provide the privacy she had long desired. Friends, colleagues, and members of her professional circle remained in contact. Nothing suggested that the world was only days away from losing one of its greatest stars. The public, however, knew very little about any of this.
Newspapers continued focusing on the difficulties surrounding Something's Got to Give. Missed production days had become headlines. Questions about Marilyn's reliability filled entertainment columns. The narrative seemed simple. Hollywood had turned against its biggest star. But behind closed doors, the situation was becoming far more complicated. Executives at 20th Century Fox understood the financial reality. Replacing Marilyn Monroe was far easier on paper than it was on a movie screen. Her popularity remained extraordinary. Audiences still wanted to see her. Industry insiders knew it. The studio knew it. Negotiations slowly moved forward. The possibility of Marilyn returning to the production was no longer impossible. At the same time, another chapter of her career was beginning to take shape. Plans were being discussed for future appearances. New creative opportunities remained under consideration. Despite the difficult headlines, Marilyn continued looking ahead. That fact is often overlooked. History sometimes compresses a person's final weeks into a single emotion.
In reality, human lives are rarely so simple. Hope and uncertainty often exist together. Marilyn's final days reflected exactly that balance. She remained under medical care, as she had been for some time. Like many people living with chronic insomnia during the early 1960s, she had been prescribed medications intended to help her sleep. Medical practices of the era were very different from those followed today. Doctors frequently prescribed combinations of medications that modern physicians would approach with much greater caution. Understanding that historical context is essential. Without it, it becomes easy to judge the past through the standards of the present. Inside the Brentwood house, life continued quietly. Morning light entered through the windows overlooking the garden. Fresh flowers remained in their vases. Books rested on tables beside comfortable chairs. Nothing had been arranged for public display. Nothing had been preserved for history.
It was simply the home of a woman trying to live beyond the image the world had created for her. Visitors who spent time with Marilyn during this period later described conversations that moved easily between ordinary topics and future ambitions. Films, books, travel, friends, work. These were not the conversations of someone performing for an audience. They were the conversations of a woman attempting to reclaim a sense of normal life. Yet outside those walls, another force was quietly growing. Public fascination. Every article generated new speculation. Every photograph invited fresh interpretation. The distance between the real Marilyn Monroe and the public image of Marilyn Monroe had perhaps never been greater. That gap would soon make the official investigation even more important. Because when tragedy strikes someone known across the world, facts often struggle to keep pace with rumor. Investigators understand this better than anyone. They know that memories can change.
Stories can evolve. Rumors can spread within hours. Evidence cannot. Evidence must be collected exactly as it exists. Before a single theory could be considered, detectives would need answers to far more basic questions. Who had seen Marilyn most recently? Who had spoken with her? Who had visited the Brentwood house? What had happened during the final 48 hours that could be confirmed through records rather than assumption? Those questions would guide everything that followed. Long before headlines declared mystery, long before documentaries debated competing theories, the investigation began with something far less dramatic: a careful reconstruction of time itself. Hour by hour, conversation by conversation, visitor by visitor. That timeline would become the foundation upon which every later conclusion and every later controversy would rest.
That timeline would become the foundation upon which every later conclusion and every later controversy would rest.
Among the people who regularly communicated with Marilyn during this period was her housekeeper, Eunice Murray. She had become an important presence inside the Brentwood home, helping manage daily routines and providing practical support around the house.
Marilyn also remained in contact with members of her professional team and several close friends. Like many public figures, her days included a mixture of business conversations and personal calls. The challenge facing investigators would later be separating confirmed events from assumptions. Who was definitely there? Who had actually spoken with Marilyn? And at what time? Those questions may sound simple, but they would become some of the most important questions in the entire investigation.
As detectives would later discover, establishing an accurate timeline was essential before any evidence inside the house could be properly understood. A prescription bottle tells very little on its own. A telephone reveals almost nothing by itself. Even a handwritten note can be misleading without knowing when it was written and what happened before and after. Context gives evidence its meaning. Without context, even ordinary objects can appear mysterious. During the final days of July and the opening days of August, Marilyn's schedule reflected a life that was still moving forward. She continued discussing professional matters. She remained engaged with people around her. There were conversations about work, future commitments, and everyday responsibilities. These documented activities challenged the popular image that everything around Marilyn had simply come to a halt. The historical record, instead, presents a woman whose life still contained unfinished plans. That does not mean everything was easy. Far from it. Years of extraordinary public attention had taken a personal toll. Marilyn had spoken openly on several occasions about the pressures of fame. She had experienced periods of emotional difficulty throughout her adult life. She had also struggled with persistent sleep problems, something confirmed by those who knew her well and reflected in her medical treatment. These facts are important because they help explain the circumstances investigators encountered later. They do not explain every question, but they provide necessary context. The Brentwood house itself reflected the balance Marilyn seemed to be searching for. Outside, the garden offered privacy from the constant attention of Hollywood. Inside, the rooms were calm and understated. Visitors often remarked that the house felt surprisingly comfortable rather than extravagant. It did not resemble a glamorous movie set. It resembled a home. That distinction matters. When investigators eventually entered the property, they were not walking into a carefully staged environment. They were entering the private space of someone who had expected to continue living there. Nothing had been prepared for history. Nothing had been arranged for public viewing. Everything they encountered represented ordinary life interrupted. As the first week of August continued, Marilyn's world remained divided between public perception and private reality. Outside the gates, newspapers continued repeating familiar stories about production delays and Hollywood gossip. Inside the gates, daily life continued through conversations, weeding, quiet moments, and plans that had not yet been completed. Neither world fully reflected the other. This contrast would become one of the defining features of Marilyn Monroe's legacy. The woman the public believed they knew, and the woman described by those closest to her, were often very different people. Understanding that difference is essential before examining the final hours of her life. Because the investigation was never simply about a famous actress. It was about a human being whose final days have too often been overshadowed by speculation. The detectives did not begin with theories. They began with facts. They collected names. They confirmed times. They compared witness statements. They documented physical evidence. Only then did they attempt to understand what had happened inside the Brentwood house. As the calendar moved toward the evening of the 4th of August, the pace of events slowly began to change. Phone calls would become increasingly important. The movements of several individuals would later be examined in detail. Small moments that seemed insignificant at the time would eventually become key pieces of the official timeline. And before the night was over, One final sequence of documented events would begin. A sequence that investigators would spend years reconstructing with extraordinary care. And before the night was over, one final sequence of documented events would begin. A sequence that investigators would spend years reconstructing with extraordinary care. Saturday, the 4th of August, began like countless other summer days in Southern California. The morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the windows of the Brentwood house, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Outside, the neighborhood remained peaceful. Children played in nearby yards. Cars passed along the tree-lined streets. Nothing about the day suggested that it would become one of the most discussed dates in Hollywood history. Inside the house, Marilyn continued with the routines that had become familiar during her time in Brentwood. The home was not filled with luxury for the sake of appearance. Instead, it reflected the life she hoped to build, private, comfortable, and removed from the constant demands of the film industry. Books remained scattered throughout the rooms.
Fresh flowers added color to the quiet interior. Music occasionally filled the house.
To visitors, it felt less like the residence of an international icon and more like the home of someone searching for normality. Throughout the day, Marilyn communicated with several people in her personal and professional life. These conversations would later become important because investigators compared witness accounts with telephone records and other documented evidence in an effort to establish the most accurate timeline possible. Every confirmed conversation helped narrow the gaps. Every verified detail strengthened the historical record. As daylight slowly faded, attention gradually shifted toward the evening. For investigators, the evening hours would prove far more significant than the morning. It was during this period that the timeline became increasingly detailed. Who contacted Marilyn? Who expected to hear from her? Who believed everything was normal?
These questions guided detectives from the very beginning.
One of the final confirmed visitors that evening was Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. His visit has been documented in witness statements and later accounts connected to the investigation. According to those accounts, the meeting appeared routine. Greenson had worked with Marilyn for some time, and discussions about her emotional well-being formed part of their professional relationship. Nothing publicly documented from that visit indicated that history was only hours away from taking a tragic turn. After leaving the house, Dr. Greenson believed Marilyn would spend the remainder of the evening quietly at home. The Brentwood residence once again became peaceful. Outside, daylight disappeared behind the California horizon. Inside, lights illuminated rooms that only a handful of people would ever see exactly as they appeared that night. No cameras were present. No reporters waited outside.
No one imagined that investigators would soon examine every corner of the property. As the hours passed, concern slowly began to grow among those closest to Marilyn. The concern did not arrive all at once. It developed gradually. A missed response. A growing sense that something was not quite right. At first, there was no reason to assume the worst. People often retire early. Telephone calls go unanswered. Lights remain on longer than expected. Ordinary explanations usually come first. But as time continued to pass, those ordinary explanations became increasingly difficult to accept. Inside the Brentwood house, the silence remained unbroken. For investigators looking back later, this period became one of the most carefully reconstructed portions of the entire case. Every witness statement was compared. Every reported time was examined. Every recollection was measured against available records. Not because detectives were searching for mystery, but because accuracy matters. When events unfold over only a few hours, even a difference of several minutes can change how an entire timeline is understood.
That commitment to precision explains why the investigation continues to attract historians today. The official record was built piece by piece, not through dramatic revelations, but through careful documentation. By the early hours of the following morning, that quiet house in Brentwood was no longer simply Marilyn Monroe's home. It had become the center of an unfolding investigation. Within a short time, physicians, law enforcement officers, photographers, and investigators would all arrive at the property. Only then would they step inside the bedroom and begin documenting the objects that would become some of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in Hollywood history.
By late evening, the Brentwood house had grown unusually quiet. The lights remained on. Outside, the neighborhood settled into the calm rhythm of an ordinary Saturday night. Few people could have imagined that this peaceful street would soon become the center of international attention. Inside the house, Marilyn was expected to spend the remainder of the evening alone. For investigators, that simple fact would later become important. Without cameras or independent witnesses inside the bedroom, detectives would have to reconstruct the final hours through documented phone calls, witness statements, and the physical evidence left inside the home. It was a process that required patience rather than assumptions. As concerns slowly increased among those closest to Marilyn, attention turned toward the house itself. According to the official investigation, housekeeper Eunice Murray became worried after noticing that Marilyn's bedroom door remained locked and that something felt unusual.
Exactly how every moment unfolded has been described differently over the years, but investigators relied primarily on the statements collected during the official inquiry and the physical evidence available at the scene. One fact was undeniable. Something inside the house had interrupted what had appeared to be an ordinary evening. The concern eventually led to calls for assistance. Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, returned to the property after being informed that something appeared to be wrong. According to the accounts given during the investigation, Greenson looked through a bedroom window after finding the bedroom door locked. What he saw immediately changed the atmosphere inside the house. Marilyn appeared motionless on the bed. Within moments, efforts shifted from concern to emergency. A physician was contacted. Authorities were notified. The quiet privacy of the Brentwood residence disappeared almost instantly. Before sunrise, the house was no longer simply a home. It had become an active investigative scene. When law enforcement officers arrived, their first responsibility was not to answer the world's questions. It was to preserve the scene exactly as they found it. Every experienced investigator understands that once a scene changes, valuable information can be lost forever. Photographs were taken before objects were moved. Rooms were documented in detail. The positions of everyday items were carefully recorded. To an outside observer, many of those objects looked completely ordinary. A bedside table, prescription medication, a telephone, books, personal belongings. Nothing appeared dramatic on its own. Yet investigators understood that evidence is rarely important because of a single object. Its meaning comes from how every detail connects to the others. The placement of an item, the condition of a room, the sequence of phone calls, the statements given by witnesses.
Only when those pieces are examined together does a clearer picture begin to emerge.
In the hours that followed, officials continued documenting the Brentwood house with extraordinary care. Every observation was written down, every photograph became part of the permanent record. Long before books proposed competing theories, detectives were focused on one responsibility alone: determining exactly what could be established through evidence. That careful approach remains important today. Many stories have been added to Marilyn Monroe's final hours over the decades. Some have entered popular culture despite lacking reliable documentation. Others have been repeated so often
that they are mistaken for established fact. Returning to the original investigation helps separate those later additions from what investigators actually encountered inside the house. And it is at this point that our story reaches the moment promised at the very beginning. The bedroom door had been opened.
The investigators were finally inside. Everything they saw would be photographed, catalogued, and preserved. The ordinary objects surrounding Marilyn Monroe would soon become some of the most closely examined pieces of evidence in Hollywood history. Those discoveries, and what they did and did not reveal, would shape one of the most enduring investigations of the 20th century.
The bedroom door had finally been opened. For the investigators standing inside that quiet Brentwood home, the moment was unlike anything the public would later imagine. There were no dramatic speeches, no immediate conclusions, no certainty. Only a room that had suddenly become the center of an investigation. The first responsibility was simple: observe everything, change nothing. Experienced investigators understand that a scene speaks only once. Every object must be documented before it is touched. Every position must be recorded before it changes. Photographers carefully began preserving the room exactly as they found it. Their images would become part of the official record, capturing details that written notes alone could never fully describe. Near the bed were several prescription medication containers. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary items found in the home of someone receiving ongoing medical treatment.
During the early 1960s, it was not uncommon for physicians to prescribe multiple medications for insomnia, anxiety, or chronic pain. Investigators did not immediately assume what those bottles meant. Instead, they documented each one. What medication had been prescribed? Who had prescribed it? When had it been filled? Those questions would later become just as important as the bottles themselves. Nearby sat a telephone. To most people, it was simply another household object. To investigators, it represented something different. It connected the physical evidence inside the room with the timeline they had already begun reconstructing. Telephone calls would later be compared with witness statements, helping investigators establish who had spoken with Marilyn during the final hours that could be confirmed. The bedroom itself showed no signs of a violent struggle. That observation became an important part of the official investigation. Furniture appeared largely undisturbed.
Personal belongings remained where they had normally been kept. Nothing suggested the kind of chaos many newspaper readers would later imagine after seeing sensational headlines. Elsewhere in the house, detectives continued their methodical work. Books remained on shelves and tables exactly where Marilyn had left them. Several reflected her long-standing interest in literature, poetry, and psychology. Friends had often spoken about her love of reading, and the home reflected that part of her personality. The investigators were not searching for symbolism. They were documenting reality. Letters and personal papers were also present within the home. As with any investigation involving a well-known public figure, detectives carefully distinguished between items that held personal significance and those that might hold investigative value. Not every document became evidence. Not every piece of paper answered a question. Many simply reflected the ordinary routines of everyday life.
That contrast is easy to overlook. When people think about famous investigations, they often imagine rooms filled with extraordinary clues. In reality, investigators usually encounter ordinary lives interrupted by extraordinary events. The Brentwood house was no exception. Fresh flowers still stood in parts of the home. Clothing remained neatly arranged. Artwork decorated the walls. Nothing inside suggested that its owner expected history to remember this house for anything other than the quiet life she had hoped to build there. As the documentation continued, every photograph, every note, and every observation became another piece of a much larger puzzle. The investigators were not trying to prove a theory.
They were trying to understand a sequence of events. Only after every room had been examined and every significant object had been recorded could the medical findings, witness statements, and timeline begin to form a complete picture.
That process would eventually lead officials to their formal conclusions. It would also leave behind questions that historians continue to examine more than 6 decades later. Not because the evidence was ignored, but because the life of Marilyn Monroe had become far larger than the investigation itself. It would also leave behind questions that historians continue to examine more than 6 decades later. Not because the evidence was ignored, but because the life of Marilyn Monroe had become far larger than the investigation itself. Once the initial documentation was complete, the investigation moved beyond the bedroom. Every room inside the Brentwood house was examined with the same careful attention. The living room reflected the quiet atmosphere that friends had often described. Books remained where they had been left. Furniture appeared orderly. Paintings and decorative objects reflected Marilyn's personal taste rather than the extravagant lifestyle many people associated with Hollywood celebrities. To investigators, these details helped establish an important fact. Nothing inside the house appeared to have been arranged for public attention. It was a private home, preserved almost exactly as it had existed during an ordinary weekend. That distinction mattered. When detectives investigate any unexpected death, they begin by asking a series of practical questions. Was anything obviously missing? Had anything been disturbed? Did the condition of the home match the statements given by witnesses? Every answer helps determine whether the physical evidence supports the known timeline. In Marilyn's case, investigators compared the condition of the house with witness interviews, medical observations, and available records. No single piece of evidence answered every question. Instead, the investigation relied on dozens of small observations that, together, formed a broader picture. Outside the house, however, events were moving much faster. News of Marilyn Monroe's death spread across Los Angeles with astonishing speed. Before long, radio stations interrupted their regular programming. Newspapers rushed to prepare special editions. Television reporters began gathering whatever verified information they could obtain. Within hours, people from around the world were learning that one of Hollywood's brightest stars was gone. The reaction was immediate. Fans gathered outside the Brentwood property. Photographers lined the street. Journalists searched for anyone willing to speak. The quiet neighborhood that Marilyn had chosen because it offered privacy suddenly became one of the busiest locations in Los Angeles. Yet inside the investigation, the atmosphere remained very different. Detectives continued working methodically. They avoided speculation. Every observation was recorded before conclusions were considered. That disciplined approach would later become one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Although public attention quickly shifted toward dramatic theories, the official inquiry remained focused on documented evidence. Medical findings were carefully reviewed. Witness statements were compared. Timelines were checked and rechecked. Physical evidence was examined within the context of the entire investigation, rather than in isolation. This distinction is essential when looking back today. Over the decades, countless books, documentaries, and television programs have revisited Marilyn Monroe's final hours. Some remained faithful to the historical record. Others introduced claims that could not be supported by official documentation. As a result, separating fact from speculation has become increasingly difficult for modern audiences. The official investigation reached its own conclusions based on the evidence available at the time. At the same time, the extraordinary fame surrounding Marilyn Monroe ensured that public debate would continue for generations. Perhaps that is why the Brentwood house still captures people's imagination. It was never simply a location. It became the place where the public image of Marilyn Monroe ended, while the historical investigation into her final hours began. More than 60 years later, the house continues to remind us of an important truth. History is often remembered through extraordinary moments, but investigators rarely begin with extraordinary moments. They begin with ordinary details. A room, a book left open, a telephone beside a bed, prescription bottles carefully documented, a quiet house that, for one unforgettable morning, became the center of one of the most closely examined investigations in Hollywood history. Those ordinary details did not answer every question, but they preserved something equally valuable. They preserved the truth of the scene as investigators found it, allowing future generations to study the evidence, distinguish documented fact from later speculation, and remember Marilyn Monroe not only as a legend of the silver screen, but as a real person whose final home became part of history forever. The investigation eventually came to an end. The questions did not. In the weeks that followed, officials reviewed medical findings, witness statements, photographs, and the evidence collected from the Brentwood house. The official conclusion became part of the public record. Yet for many people, accepting the end of Marilyn Monroe's story proved far more difficult than understanding the investigation itself. Perhaps that is the burden carried by every cultural icon. The larger their public image becomes, the more people search for explanations that reach beyond the documented facts. Marilyn Monroe was no exception. Over the decades, countless theories emerged. Some questioned the official findings. Others suggested events for which no reliable evidence has ever been produced. Those theories became books. They became television specials. They became internet discussions repeated from one generation to the next. But history asks us to make an important distinction.
A theory is not the same as evidence. A rumor is not the same as a documented fact. The official investigation can be examined. The photographs can be studied. The witness statements can be compared. The medical reports can be reviewed. That evidence forms the foundation upon which every serious historical examination must begin. Whether every question has been answered is something historians continue to debate. But the investigation itself deserves to be understood as it was conducted, not as it has sometimes been imagined. When people remember Marilyn Monroe today, they often picture the white dress above the subway grate. They remember the unforgettable smile, the Hollywood premieres, the magazine covers, the glamorous photographs that transformed her into one of the most recognizable faces of the 20th century. Yet inside the Brentwood house, investigators encountered none of those carefully crafted images. They encountered books that had been read, rooms that had been lived in, flowers that had been arranged, a telephone waiting in silence, prescription bottles documented with professional precision, a home that reflected everyday life rather than celebrity mythology. Perhaps that is the most revealing discovery of all. Not a hidden document, not a dramatic clue, not a single object that solved every mystery. Instead, investigators found the traces of an ordinary human life belonging to an extraordinary woman. More than 6 decades have passed since that quiet Sunday morning in Brentwood. Hollywood has changed. The neighborhood has changed. Entire generations have grown up knowing Marilyn Monroe only through photographs and films. But the questions surrounding her final days continued to remind us why history must always be approached with patience, evidence, and humility. Because behind every legend is a real person. Behind every headline is a human story. And behind the door of that quiet Brentwood house, investigators did not discover a myth. They discovered the final chapter of a life that had inspired millions, challenged Hollywood, and left a legacy that continues to endure long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the end, the most important thing found inside Marilyn Monroe's home was not an object at all. It was a reminder.
A reminder that fame cannot erase loneliness, that success cannot guarantee peace, and that the smallest details, carefully preserved by history, often tell us more than the loudest rumors ever could. For Marilyn Monroe, the lights of Hollywood eventually faded, but her story never did. And perhaps that is why, even today, people continue searching for answers, not simply because they want to understand how her life ended, but because they are still trying to understand the remarkable woman who lived it.